All right, so now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about how the central nervous system that we've been learning about, how it gets its information in order to make those decisions, and then how it transmits that information out. Now, we've talked about it a little bit before when we've talked about the autonomic nervous system, right? The automatic part. We've talked about the somatic nervous system and how we innervate skeletal muscles. So a lot of that motor output has been covered previously. So a lot of what we're going to see with the peripheral nervous system will be how we sense the world about us, how we sense the world within us, and then how we get that information in, processing it, and then generating some type of response. So, like we said, peripheral nervous system is going to be outside of the central nervous system. So when we had that whole schematic from the beginning, where we were looking at what central nervous system is and what peripheral nervous system is, central nervous system was the brain and the spinal cord. And peripheral nervous system then, outside of the central, is going to be everything else. And that's going to be broken down into four parts, the different receptors. And for the most part, what we're going to be talking about in this section is some of the simplified receptors. So these are going to be sometimes so simple that they're just going to be like a bare wire. Other ones are going to be encapsulated. They'll have more of a structure to them. But we have even more complex ones that we call the special sense organs, whole organs made up of multiple tissue types that are all then kind of working together for a particular function of generally sensing the world around us. So we'll talk about that in a separate chapter, but we'll start talking about these different types of receptors and their modalities. Then we'll talk about, again, how this sensory information gets in and these peripheral nerves that are going out and coming in. And then finally, we'll talk about the motor endings and motor activity again. And a lot of that will be refresher information from what we've seen before. And then finally, we'll also talk a bit about reflexes. And again, we mentioned that somewhat when we were talking about the spinal cord and how we were saying that there are some very simplified sensory processing and then motor responses that can even go just to the spinal cord. And we can get a very simplified response just at that level as well. So we'll see that again too. All right, so this is what we had seen before, right? So central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So we're focusing on peripheral nervous system now. And so in this case, right, we are talking about the sensory or afferent division, right? So that's where our sensors are going to be picking up the world around us and then transmitting that information into the afferent or sensory neurons. Also, motor or efferent division, right? We saw that there's somatic, there's autonomic, and the autonomic has its two divisions, right? Sympathetic and parasympathetic. Remember sympathetic? The phrase that goes with that is Dora the Explorer time, fight or flight. Parasympathetic, rest and digest, right? Like the gas pedal and the brake. Okay, so breaking into those four parts, we're going to start with sensory receptors. And so the key thing with these receptors is that they are responding to different stimuli, so changes in the environment. And we'll see that some are adapted to responding only to changes, some will send information all the time. But the key thing here is that they are acting as translators for the nervous system. So they have to translate something about inside of us or outside of us and transmit it into something the nervous system can understand. Remember, the nervous system can only understand, right? Action potentials, graded potentials, neurotransmitters, right? It's just bzz, 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 moving ions across the membrane. That's all it does. So if you take a light and you shine it on the brain or you shine it on the spinal cord, nothing's going to happen, right? If you take a big booming speaker and you put it right on the surface of the brain, nothing's going to happen. They don't understand that. So the receptors have to be able to translate this information, okay? And then we're going to talk about how they'll translate that information. It's going to route it then up the sensory or afferent neurons to the brain, and then we're going to perceive that information. So there is the difference between awareness of the stimulus, is what's called sensation, and then perception that we're going to get occurring in the brain itself. But first off, let's take a look at these receptors. And we can classify them in three different ways. based on what they respond to, the stimulus that they're translating, where they're located, and then whether they're encapsulated or not, or basically their structure. Okay, so make sure with those three categories you know different examples of those, right? So if we're asking you to compare and contrast those that are inside the body or outside the body or what they sense, etc., you can categorize them in that way, much like we were categorizing joints before and things like that. Okay, so by stimulus type, and luckily the name of these receptors really reflect what they are responding to in terms of a stimulus. So mechanoreceptors are responding to physical deformation. What happens is with the receptor, you press on it, and what it does is it bends that plasma membrane with the different channels in it, and much like once upon a time, I think I mentioned this to you guys, but once upon a time, there used to be these things called ice cube trays, right? So rather than having a automatic ice maker in your refrigerator, you would have to use these ice cube trays, right? So you pour in the water, put it in the freezer, and then in order to get those ice cubes out, what you had to do is you had to bend that flexible tray. And when you bent it, it changed its shape and it would eject the ice cube, right? I have a feeling I told you that story before. But mechanoreceptors work much in the same way, right? So remember before we had different types of channels, right? So we had, for instance, channels that were chemically gated channels or ligand gated channels. We had voltage gated channels and things like that. These ones tend to be, like we said, deformed by a mechanical stimulation, and that then gets that receptor to respond. So touch, pressure, receptors, vibration, and stretch. So as you can imagine, some of these will be associated with, for instance, muscles, but we'll also find some in other peculiar places you might not think about. So for instance, like the ear. All right, so we have mechanoreceptors. Then we have thermoreceptors. Guess what they sense? Temperature, right? So we'll talk about different types of thermoreceptors, those that respond to heat, those that respond to cold, etc. Photoreceptors, those are pretty straightforward, right? They only respond to photons of light, so respond to light energy. We'll talk about that mainly when we get to the eye. For the most part, that's where our photoreceptors are located, but more and more we are discovering, at least in other organisms, they'll have photoreceptors in other areas. Like, for instance, different types of cephalopods, like octopus and stuff like that, they'll have photoreceptors along their body. So they don't have to necessarily get that photoreception in their eye. They can get photoreception in other areas of their body. Lizards have a third eye on top of their head that can actually, remember that pineal gland we talked about for melanopsin, or melanin, which relates to melanopsin we'll talk about later. So that's where they get their light stimulus into that particular pineal gland. In any case, photoreceptors, light. Chemoreceptors, chemicals, different types of chemicals. So mostly we're talking about those associated with gustation or taste, but there's lots of chemoreceptors that are responding to like oxygen or pH, like hydrogen ions, etc. So things that we need to be sensitive to in the blood. How much calcium is there? How much glucose is there, etc. Nociceptors. Now this one isn't quite so straightforward when we look at the term. For instance, all these other ones say receptor at the end. This one just says ceptor. Okay, so notice that different. And then the noci part, right, that isn't quite so obvious, but these are responding to pain. So nociceptors are taking the extreme of some of these other types of receptors, right? Mechanoreceptors, oh, okay, just pushing, ow, that hurts. Now we've graduated to nociceptors. Oh, this is nice and warm, it's warm on my face. Ow, it's too hot. That's now from thermoreceptor to nociceptor, okay? So it gives us the idea that that particular tissue is actually being damaged now, that stimulus is so extreme that it's causing pain or damage. Okay, so that was based on what? Stimulus. Now we are looking at the next category, which is based on location. So there are exteroreceptors that are sensing the world around us. So you can imagine these are going to be around the edges of our body, right? So like in the skin, touch and pressure receptors, those would be mechanoreceptors. Pain receptors are what? Nociceptors. Temperature receptors, thermoreceptors, right? So those are often, a lot of those are going to be exteroreceptors. And then of course our special sense organs, right? For smell and taste and sight and hearing and equilibrium. All right, interoreceptors. So internal guts. These are also known as visceroreceptors because they are monitoring the internal condition, right? So we can maintain that homeostasis. So like we said, we're going to have chemoreceptors, for instance. We're going to have mechanoreceptors to tell what's going on, right? Oh, my stomach is full, like after Thanksgiving or something like that. Temperature receptors, so that we can see, oh, okay, my internal body temperature is getting too high, etc. You'll even have, like we said, chemoreceptors for oxygen and pH and things like that. Okay. Now this one as well is kind of like a subcategory. Proprioreceptors. Proprioreceptors are about the body itself, but they are giving you the idea of body position. So they are telling you when a joint is flexed or extended, or a muscle is stretched, or is it relaxed, etc. And so they tell us where our body is positioned. So for instance, you can put your hand behind your back, and you can, if somebody tells you to hold up one finger or two fingers, you play that game odd or even, you can behind your back choose to put up one finger or two fingers without looking back there to know that it's occurring, right? So proprioceptors, often found in joints and associated with different types of skeletal muscles. Okay, so third category is by receptor structure. So like we said, some are very simple and some are going to be more complex, even to the extreme when we're talking about the special senses. So generally, the most of the ones that we'll talk about today are going to be a little bit simplified, but there's still two categories. One are going to be unencapsulated, kind of naked exposed ones, like we said, kind of like naked wires, and the others are going to be encapsulated instead. So what we find is that, again, for our general senses, like some of the ones that we've been talking about, we tend to have these two different categories. So the free nerve endings and then the encapsulated nerve endings. And so this is table 13.1 from your book, and it shows a few examples of non-encapsulated, right? So definitely these kind of look like exposed wires, like we can see here, right? So when we look at these ones can be, for instance, thermoreceptors, just like an exposed wire. There are some types of chemoreceptors that are like this, even itch receptors, etc. Pressure and things like that, and nociceptors. So generally, the most common examples of our free nerve endings are things like thermoreceptors and nociceptors, but there are other ones too. This one that we see here, a tactile or Merkel disc, this one is non-encapsulated, but it's a specialized cell. It's called a tactile cell. So it's just a cell and it's non-encapsulated. This third one, remember when we talked about the skin? We talked about if the hair is blowing, it gives you an idea about what's going on around you. And so we have to have different types of nerve endings wrapping our hair follicle to tell us that. So hair follicle receptors are also a type of non-encapsulated receptor. Now we look at encapsulated, those that are covered up in something. So Meissner corpuscles, remember those? Saw those in the skin, up in those little finger-like structures. You remember those, the dermal papillae? We also have the Pacinian corpuscles that are found down deeper in the dermis, kind of in cross-section. They look like an onion. We also have what are called the Ruffini endings, and you can see how these are associated with mechanical stimulation. So you can see how it's wrapping certain structures associated with the skin, etc., or joints and things like that. Muscle spindles, if you look at these, so these are wrapping around muscles, and they tell us when the muscle is stretched or when it is relaxed. Tendon organs are also around the tendons, again telling us whether we are stretched or not. And then there are some what are called joint kinesthetic receptors. These are our proprioceptors. So the first couple of ones, the Meissner corpuscles and Pacinian corpuscles, are some of the most obvious ones that we've seen before, and they're very large in terms of their encapsulation. The other ones are a little bit smaller and harder to see, but they still count. Okay, so these are the ones, this is just a review slide, like we said, non-encapsulated. These are some of the most common ones, like temperature and pain, thermoreceptor, and nociceptors. The thermoreceptors, like we said, are pretty interesting because what we find is that there are two different types of receptors, cold receptors and heat receptors. It's not just like light and dark, like did it have heat or does it not have heat? You actually have some for cold. So between 10 and 40 degrees Celsius, then the cold receptors are going to be stimulated. Now from 32 to 48 degrees C, the heat receptors are going to be stimulated. And you can see there's an overlap here, right? So when you have warm water, then that is going to have both receptors being stimulated. Kind of like if you use both the cold and the hot water input at the sink, right? You're getting input from both. But if you get outside of those temperature ranges, too hot or too cold, then again, we're going to get nociceptors, right? You can get frostbite, or freezer burn, if you will. You can get a regular burn and things like that. Now, remember, when we're talking about burns and things, we talk about the perception as well that occurs up in the brain. You know how different people have different pain tolerances? Well, that has less to do with the receptors and more having to do with the perception of pain, right? So some people, they get really sensitive about like needles or something like that. Hate needles. Ooh, I can feel it. It's going to hurt. Ow, 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 ow. Other people don't mind at all. They barely even notice it, right? Same needle, same skin to a certain extent, right? Similar skin. And so there is the perception differences as well. Okay. So in any case, like we said, thermoreceptors, nociceptors, etc. So these ones are extreme temperature changes, extreme mechanoreception, extreme chemical release, etc. So then we have the more of the non-encapsulated ones. We talked about these. So this just gives us the text that goes along with what I was showing you in the table. So encapsulated one, Meissner's and Pacinian corpuscles, Ruffini endings, muscle spindles, tendon organs, and kinesthetic receptors. You can see a lot of these have to do with that somatic nervous system. Okay, so the second category that we're going in, the second section of this, has to do with the processing of that sensory information. So we'll save that for a second section and a second lecture next.